President.
Senator from Ohio.
Mr. President, I have one unanimous consent request for a committee to meet during today's session of the Senate. This request has the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that this request be agreed to and that this request be printed in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I rise today to pay tribute to a dear and cherished friend, a mentor, and a role model, former Yellow Springs, Ohio Chief of Police of 34 years, Jim McKee, who passed away on January 18th of this year at the age of 73. Raised in Springfield, Ohio, Jim McKee moved to Yellow Springs when he was 18 years old, fresh out of high school and in search of a job. During his first years in Yellow Springs, Jim held a number of different positions, working in a shoe repair shop and later at Mills Lawn Elementary School. Now, Mr. President, it was at Mills Lawn Elementary School that I first met my future wife, Frances, in first grade. But it was also at Mills Lawn that I first met Jim McKee. Jim was the person that kept things going at Mills Lawn. I remember how much respect and love and admiration the students had for Jim. And I first saw in Jim the ability he had to connect with people. I saw it as a child. I remember he would gather the students together and talk to them about how we need to keep the place looking good and how important that was. And I remember how we looked up to him and how much we respected him. Eventually, Jim McKee took a job at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base near my hometown of Yellow Springs. But by 1957, Jim decided that he needed to move on. And true to form, Jim saw this change not as a bad thing, but really as a new opportunity. An opportunity to do something that he'd always dreamed of doing, and that is to get involved in law enforcement. This was his chance, his opportunity, and before long he was realizing that dream. The village of Yellow Springs then hired him as a police officer. He joined a department of 2 officers and a chief, small department at the time, and within 2 short years and the recognition of his talent and his hard work, Jim McKee was appointed chief of police. In this new leadership position, Jim McKee soon found himself dealing with issues that he probably didn't think that he was going to be dealing with, issues of historic importance. Because you see, at that time, the civil rights movement was beginning to sweep our country. And the civil rights movement had reached Yellow Springs, a small community in southwest Ohio, my hometown. It reached Yellow Springs earlier, sooner, than most other parts of the country. And you see, Jim McKee was one of the few African-American chiefs of police in the state of Ohio. Jim McKee guided my hometown with great skill through a very difficult period of time. As one of the few African-American chiefs of police in the state, really one of the few in the country at the time, Jim McKee faced his own civil rights issues early on in the movement. Everybody in Yellow Springs, community then and now of great diversity, and a community that then and now embodies a really a person's right to free speech. Everybody in Yellow Springs respected and liked Jim McKee. And that made all the difference in the world. And whether Jim realized it at the time or not, during this tumultuous era, Jim was, in fact, playing a part in our American history. Jim McKee kept the peace, maintained order, and all the while respected people's freedom of speech, their right to demonstrate, and their civil rights. And he did it in a professional way. I remember when Dr. Martin Luther King came to Yellow Springs to deliver the commencement address at Antioch College. Chief McKee, of course, provided his security detail. Years later, recalling this experience with Dr. King, Chief McKee had this to say, and I quote, "At the time there were rumors that they were out to get him. I saw him do his nonviolent teachings. I drove around in the car with him for 2 days. He was a perfect Christian gentleman, and I was frightened to death because I was providing his security. We told people he was staying at the Antioch Inn, but in fact, he was right across the street from where I live, in the home his wife, Coretta, lived in as a student at Antioch years before. You would think they would have figured it out with all the police cruisers parked out front. I was never so glad to see a plane take off." End of quote. Now, despite whatever concerns Jim McKee may have had, the chief performed his duties with a great sense of professionalism and with honor and courage. Though he dealt with significant issues on the national stage, Chief McKee dedicated his career to Yellow Springs and to keeping the community he loved so much safe and free from crime. Mr. President, as you know and members of the Senate know, or may not know, Yellow Springs is not a large city, it's a village. It's a small village where people know their neighbors and watch out for one another. Even today, I believe there are probably only about 8 or so police officers on the force. Chief McKee, as the local police chief, was really an icon in his home community. He was greatly admired and respected as an officer, as a protector, but most of all as a friend. Though I first met him as an elementary school student, actually in the first grade, I had the opportunity later on to reconnect with him. Our lives came together again when I became an assistant county prosecuting attorney, and he was, by that time, the dean of the chiefs of police in Greene County. And I knew him then later when I became the prosecutor of our home county. And we worked on a number of cases that arose out of Yellow Springs, several very difficult rape cases. We worked on several of those cases together, and during this time I learned a great deal about how Chief McKee treated people and how he dealt with some of the most tense situations. Perhaps most importantly, though, I saw his great sense of humanity towards both victims and suspects. Chief Jim McKee taught me that there is more to police work than arrests and convictions. Much, much more. He taught me about the human component in police work. He taught me about people and about compassion. Mr. President, I remember one instance in particular when I saw and learned about how Jim McKee dealt with a man who had been in an auto accident. And this man it was a horrible, horrible thing, as many auto accidents are, and this man had been involved in an auto accident. He came out of it and he walked out, but the other person in the other vehicle did not, and the other person died. And this particular person was actually a suspect. And he could have been charged, and the police were looking at and trying to decide whether to charge him. And later on, actually, there was a grand jury that was convened. And later on, the grand jury had to make a decision whether this person was going to be charged. And have to stand trial, and eventually they decided not to charge him, but Jim didn't know that at the time. But I saw how Jim dealt with this man and showed this man who was going through great anguish at the time, man who was really a suspect, and saw how Jim worked him through this and talked to him and showed great kindness to him. That's how Jim McKee treated everyone, with great kindness, with great compassion, all the time being a professional, all the time doing his job. It was this compassion that set Jim McKee apart. He cared deeply about people and just knew how to deal with them. At the end of Chief McKee's distinguished 36-year career in law enforcement, I had the honor of attending his farewell banquet. I was lieutenant governor at the time and was there to pay tribute to the chief on behalf of the entire state of Ohio and on behalf of then Governor George Voinovich. At this reception and this dinner, I was struck by the sheer outpouring of respect and admiration and appreciation for Chief McKee's work and for his selfless contributions to our community. It was clear at this reception how important Chief McKee was to the people of the village of Yellow Springs and to the entire law enforcement community across the state of Ohio. And I was proud to be a part of this memorable event. Following his retirement from the force in 1993, Chief McKee remained active in the community until the day he died. He was a key member of the Yellow Springs Men's Group, an organization dedicated to studying issues important to the day-to-day lives of Yellow Springs residents. Through this organization, the James A. McKee Scholarship Fund was established in 2002 as a tribute both to Jim and to his legacy of community involvement. In the recent days following Jim's death, a number of newspapers ran articles about his life and his legacy. And as I read, Mr. President, through these tributes, I was especially taken with a statement from my friend Paul Ford, who had known Chief McKee since 1949. This is what Mr. Ford said: "We've lost a good citizen, a good friend, and a humanitarian. Once you met Jim, you were a friend." Indeed, Mr. President, Jim McKee was my friend and someone for whom I had a great affection and admiration. This quote really gets to why Chief McKee was so special to the community of Yellow Springs and to all of us who knew him. He dedicated his life to serving the people of Yellow Springs. He worked to keep his community safe and free from crime. When I think about Jim McKee and his life's work as a police officer and protector of the community, I'm reminded of a Bible passage from Matthew. "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." Indeed, Mr. President, Chief Jim McKee was a peacemaker and a protector and just a good and decent, hard-working man. He was a kind person, a kind human being who always tried to do the right thing for his family, for his community, and for his nation. Mr. President, my wife Fran and I extend our heartfelt sympathy and our prayers for the entire McKee family, for his wife of 54 years, Naomi, his 4 daughters, Barry, Karen, Sandra, his son Jimmy, his 5 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandson. Jim McKee loved his family and cared deeply for them. And I know that they, like all of us, will miss him tremendously. So, thank you, Jim, for all that you did for Yellow Springs and for our nation. You will be remembered always in our minds and in our hearts. Mr. President, thank the chair, and I yield the floor.